December 16, 1944. The German army begins a last desperate attack in the Ardennes, with which they intended to get the Western Allies out of the war, or at least, to have a pause to be able to focus on repelling the Red Army's offensive in the east. For the new operation, the Germans gathered their best remaining divisions, including the Leibstandard, Das Reich, Hohenstaufen, Hitlerjugend, and the Panzer Division Lehr. Divided into three armies, the German forces aimed to make their way to the port city of Antwerp, thereby isolating a significant part of the British and American forces deployed on the Western Front, between Aachen and the Atlantic coast. Before beginning to explain what was the opinion of men like Walter Model, Rundstedt, and Manteuffel about their defeat in the Ardennes, let us briefly analyze the operation. As a summary, what was known as the Battle of the Bulge can be divided into 6 phases. Phase 1 corresponds to the initial assault during the first 2 days, the infiltration behind the enemy's first line and advance from the border, searching for passes through the enemy positions. During this stage, relative success was achieved, although progress was much less than expected. In the second phase, starting on December 18th and 19th, Allied reactions are included, especially in the southern sector. Basically, it was the stage in which the Allies began to mobilize all their reserves, which were sent as reinforcements to the Ardennes to block the German offensive. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Division, and part of Patton's Third Army, stand out. Phase 3 took place starting on December 20th, and during it, the 6th SS Panzer Army was completely stuck in the northern sector of the German wedge. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army continued to try to break through and reach the Meuse, and on the southern flank, the 7th Army took up defensive positions. From here, the German offensive is reoriented towards the 5th Army sector. Furthermore, during the third phase, the city of Bastogne is surrounded, so the Germans are forced to allocate troops there that can no longer be used in the advance towards the Meuse River. In the fourth phase, we arrive at Christmas 1944, during which the weather changes completely. It is characterized by the appearance of the Allied aviation, which crushes all the German columns, both in the vanguard and in the rear. Despite this, the vanguard of the 5th Army managed to reach the vicinity of Celles, which marked the maximum point of German advance in the Ardennes. Phase 5 takes place at the end of the month, when the fighting concentrates around Bastogne. Due to the ravages of Allied aviation, the Germans barely receive any supplies, and are forced to go completely on the defensive. Finally, Patton definitively breaks the siege of Bastogne on December 27th. And finally, during Phase 6, starting in January 1945, Allied progress on both flanks of the German wedge begins to increasingly threaten to pocket part of the German troops that are still fighting in the salient, due to Hitler's refusal to withdraw. Starting on January 12th and 13th, the 6th SS Panzer Army received the order to head towards the Hungarian front, and the Germans gradually returned to their starting positions. Well, once the operation has been summarized, let's now see what the main German generals said about the reasons for the failure of the last major offensive that the German army was able to launch on the Western Front. Firstly, General Manteuffel commented that his army lacked more units. Furthermore, he complained that other attacks were not taking place along the Western Front, intended to pin down enemy forces and draw reserves away from the Ardennes. In this way, because the attack was only through the Ardennes, the North American reserves headed there at full speed, and began to hinder the advance of the 3 attacking German armies. In comparison, during the 1940 attack, Army Group B was available to attack through Holland to pin all Franco-British troops away from the Ardennes. If, instead, certain positions or sectors had been chosen where to anchor the enemy, attracting its reserves to those points, perhaps the vanguards would have been able to break through more continuously, and with less fuel expenditure. As the lines of advance and the roads did not allow greater concentration, the infantry ended up trapping the armored forces behind them, who were forced to rush forward at the slightest opportunity. The initial approach of the infantry, opening gaps for exploitation by the panzers, quickly fell into disuse. The quality of the Volksgrenadier divisions, their training, their lack of experience and ability to carry out enveloping maneuvers instead of frontal attack, would make it impossible to open the expected gaps. In such a way that, as in 1940, the armored vehicles assumed this function, causing a new added delay, compared to the Allied reserves that knew exactly where they should go, instead of being attracted to another position. Manteuffel predicted the relatively weak initial enemy resistance and the non-existence of important reserves immediately behind the first line. But for him, more important was to understand the small force that General Brandenberger's 7th Army represented compared to what could come upon it, which were nothing less than the reserves coming from the southern sector, where Patton's 3rd Army was located. Added to the reinforcement of the 2 airborne divisions, and the stagnation of the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, Manteuffel's 5th Army became strangled as the days went by. In a conference he had with Hitler on December 26 or 27, Manteuffel told the German leader that he would not be able to cross the Meuse. Göring reacted by saying that the war was lost, and requested a truce. Hitler, full of anger, forbade him to speak on an issue in relation to a negotiated peace and threatened executions. From here on, Hitler did not mention Antwerp again, but remained obsessed with taking Bastogne, in a similar way to what happened at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. His conquest would represent the symbol of his victory. Once in private, he stayed with his assistant Nicholas von Below, and told him that the war was lost, but that they would take everyone along. They would never capitulate. Next, let's see the opinion of Marshal Walter Model. Only 2 days after the start of the offensive, Model already realized that, despite the numerous tactical successes, and the rapid progression of some panzer columns towards the west amid the chaos of panicked American units, the operation as a whole it was not going well at all. On the night of December 18th, Model telephoned Rundstedt, telling him that the offensive had failed due to the inability of the Waffen-SS Panzer divisions to break through. Model now doubted whether the small solution he had proposed during the planning phase could even be realized. By December 19th, the situation had become definitively blocked in the north, so Model decided to put the brunt of the attack on the 5th Panzer Army sector of Manteuffel. To this end, he sent the Fürbiglight Brigade to support the connection between the 6th SS Panzer Army and Manteuffel's 5th, heading towards St. Vith. In total, the brigade had about 90 tanks, and they constituted the reserve of the 5th Panzer Army destined to act in the exploitation phase. Manteuffel opposed its use in this action, but Model forced the unit to enter combat immediately. And finally, let's look at the opinion and reaction of Marshal Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front, to the failure of the Ardennes Offensive. Rundstedt informed Hitler during the night of December 24 that the offensive had failed. From here, he recommended carrying out a withdrawal from the salient before the bulk of Army Group B became trapped. For his part, Hitler angrily rejected the advice and insisted on carrying out more attacks on Bastogne, not realizing that even more Allied reinforcements were arriving. At a general level, the 3 main reasons for Germany's defeat in World War II according to Rundstedt were the following. First, the unprecedented Allied air superiority, which made all daytime movement impossible. Second, the lack of fuel, which left the panzers and even the remains of the Luftwaffe immobile. Third, the systematic destruction of all railway communications, which made it impossible to move even a single train to the other side of the Rhine. This did not make the transfer of troops and goods possible, and deprived us of all mobility. Well, once we have seen the opinion and reaction of the 3 main generals involved, let us finish analyzing the German failure in the Ardennes in December 1944. The main problems that led to the failure of the operation were the inability to advance towards the Meuse River before the Allied reserves arrived, the lack of adequate infantry and armor support, and the delay in changing strategy. Lack of coordination and operational incompetence of many units were also important ingredients of failure. The rapid response of the Allies and the allocation of reinforcements in key areas were essential in stopping the German advance. Although acceptable progress was made during the initial phase, shortly before Christmas Day, lack of fuel, favorable weather, and a shortage of troops for key objectives such as Bastogne revealed the plan's weaknesses. The lack of fixation of the Allied units allowed the German armor to face direct resistance instead of finding free routes, which turned the offensive into a battle of attrition. From an operational point of view, it is striking that the German armies, the 15th and the 1st Army, concentrated to the north and south of the Ardennes sector, had not implemented a deception maneuver or secondary attack that could divert the attention of the Allied forces. If Hitler's intention was to play it all on one card, he should have committed all his forces to maximize the chances of the offensive's success, which was ultimately not done. By Christmas Eve 1944, supplies and fuel were almost non-existent, not only to advance but even to ensure a dignified retreat. The majority of the generals involved in the offensive, and this regardless of the fact that later, or even during the planning itself, they showed certain doubts, expressed their firm belief that, under the premise that the starting conditions were met, the objective of Antwerp was doable. However, the majority, such as Rundstedt, Manteuffel, and Model, were convinced that achieving first the envelopment and destruction of the Allied troops in Aachen, which they proposed as the lesser solution, would considerably increase the possibilities of taking Antwerp, as enemy pressure on the northern flank of the main advance decreased. Furthermore, it would have implied a deployment of enemy reserves not directly towards the Ardennes, and would have relieved traffic on the deployment routes in this sector.